Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is a tutorial about how to pick up stitches for your sleeves. Now, this tutorial is going to be particularly useful for those of you who are working on top-down sweaters where you're not using a provisional cast-on for the sleeve, where when you separated the sleeves for the body, you basically cast on a number of extra stitches under here, and they're just kind of sitting there, and they need to be picked up in order to be knit in the round for your sleeve. Now I'm working specifically on Rachel Ilsley's Orbits sweater, which is a top-down yoked pullover with just about all over colorwork. There's a little bit of plain non-colorwork stockinette down here at the bottom. And you can see that I'm going to be working on the right-hand sleeve. The left-hand sleeve is all finished, and one of the cool things about this sweater is this colorwork is continuous through about 2/3 of the body and 2/3 of the sleeve. So let me show you this armpit first and foremost. This armpit I finished up, and with colorwork sweaters in particular, what you're trying to achieve is to make sure that if someone were to look at your armpits, you have some nice symmetry going on here. So in my case, I do. This is the center line, and you can see that the center line lines up with the diamond on the sleeve, the diamond on the body, and I don't have any obvious seam going on there. It's just kind of a nice continuation of the pattern. I also have a couple tricks I'll show you for making sure that you don't have any holes in your underarms where you're joining the main fabric from the sleeve to the body. So we'll talk all about that. But this is what we want our sleeve to look like on the right-hand side in the end. So let's turn over and have a look at what we do have. So what we do have here is obviously the sleeve opening. I have all of my sleeve stitches which were kept live on waste yarn back on my needles, and this is the area where I need to be picking up stitches. We're going to come back to this in just a moment. But the first thing I want to talk about is stitch orientation. When you're trying to pick up stitches, if you're working from a sweater that was knit from the bottom up, your stitches are going to look pretty normal when you get to this point in the armpit. They're going to look like little V's, and you're going to pick up just at the top of each V. It's easier to see. But with this sweater and other top-down sweaters, it was knit in this direction. So when I look at it upside down, all of my stitches look like normal little V's. And that would be the normal orientation for thinking about, stockinette knitting. But because this was knit upside down, when you start looking at the stitches right side up, or when the sweater is oriented from the top down, everything is going to be reversed. So instead of seeing V's, you're going to see little A's. You see here, all the little stitches look like A's. So finding columns of stitches for when and where you're going to pick them up, you need to be looking for not the V, but the A. And that's one of the important things to remember if you're working on a top-down sweater. Now, after stitch orientation, you want to think about how many stitches you're supposed to be picking up. I know that for my size in this sweater, I need to be picking up 18 stitches across this span. And that means that I want to pay attention to where my center line is so that I can think about picking up 9 stitches on this side and 9 stitches on this side. Now I'm going to add a 10th stitch over here and perhaps one over here to make sure that close happens very nicely without any hole in my armpit. The next thing to figure out is where your midpoint actually is. Now with colorwork, it's both sometimes easy and hard to figure that out. In this case, since I've already knit the rest of the body, I have a very clear center line here that runs from this little orbit all the way up here, and I've marked it with my little special marker, it's a little whale, so that I'll know that this is the center stitch. It's also going to be the first stitch of my second half. So it's going to be, I'm going to have 9 stitches over here, and then 9 stitches on this half of that center marker. You'll remember that from the other sleeve, right? Over here we had this nice diamond shape, and we wanted to make sure that this lines up nicely. So that's our same center line coming up, and that's going to be the same center line that we use over on our right-hand sleeve. After that, you want to think about where you are in the pattern, especially if you're working colorwork, but also if you're working things like cables or lace. And let's say you had a seam running up the side here that was a beautiful faux cable, like you see sometimes in Isabel Kramer's patterns, you'd want to make sure that that faux cable remained front and center when you're coming to pick up your stitches for your sleeve, so that when you knit down, if that cable continues down the arm, you're going to make sure that you have those stitches oriented correctly. So for color work, for cables, for lace, you're going to want to make sure that you know where you are in the pattern before you start picking up stitches. Now what I've done here, I'm going to bring the camera in lower for you. I've marked each of my stitch columns with a safety pin, not because that's how I usually do it, but so that you could see the columns, hopefully. So if I start in the center with my little whale, you'll notice that when I tug upward, you can see the little A right there. And so I know that I'm right in the center of that column, and that's going to be one stitch. Now, if I know that that is the center, I know that I'm going to have 9 stitches going this way and another 8 stitches going this way. This is my 9th for the other half. So if I look at where I've put in my next placeholder, that's the next column of stitches right there. You can see that on the camera. Same for the next one. Next column of stitches is a little harder to see in the gray. Next column of stitches is here. You can see it with the white A right there going up. Same with this guy. Next column of stitches. So I've tried to mark each column all the way over, and I started with the center and I went to the edge because it's easier to see which columns are which. And then I can see that this column right here is my last official column, because I know that I cast on an additional 18 stitches total, so 9 brings me all the way over to here. This netherland, this kind of hinterland over here, is where I'm going to pick up an additional extra stitch just to make that close nice and tight with no hole. And that extra stitch is going to go away because I'm going to knit 2 together, so it won't be an actual extra stitch for the colorwork pattern. It's just for that first round of knitting. We're going to pick one extra one up over here. And we do the same thing on this side. If we start with the center stitch, we know this is our center column, and we need to pick up an additional 8 stitches going this way. So again, you can see that I'm picking up the next column, all the way over. And in this case, I've picked up that extra 10th stitch that I'm going to show you over here. So if I count over, this is the last stitch in the actual pattern. You can see that's the A right there, little reverse V. That's the last official stitch in the colorwork pattern. And I'm going to pick up one additional one over here, and that's going to be the extra stitch that I use to knit 2 together to close my work. Okay, so you don't need to mark everything with safety pins if you're just working by yourself and not putting together a tutorial, but I do think that it helps you to see the actual columns and to count from that center point out to the edges. If you start at the edge and go toward the center, it's harder to know if you've grabbed the right columns, especially when you get to these edges, because it's harder to tell where the stitches kind of start for the pickup. But once you've counted from the center out, you know where your final column of stitches actually is. So here we are ready to actually begin picking up our stitches. And as a reminder, the rest of our sleeve stitches are already here on our needles because I put them on waste yarn and then just picked them back up. They're in pattern, ready to go. So we are going to start at this corner of the sleeve to start picking up stitches. Now, as you'll remember, this side I hadn't marked the extra stitch that I'm going to pick up just to close the hole. Different people do this different ways. You see, it's not quite a stitch, it's on the edge of the stitches, and that is just to make sure that I can close that hole up later, and I'm not creating any new holes by picking up in a kind of funny place. So I'm going to get that guy through. So there's our first stitch, and that's our extra stitch. So our first official stitch is coming from this column here. I think you can see that right there. So we're going to get into that column, and our little stitch marker is going to be slightly in the way, but that's okay. We're going to separate out our yarn here, and we're going to pick up that stitch. Okay. And I'm going to remove the markers as I go because it'll make it a little bit easier. Again, the markers are more for your benefit than for my own benefit. And I can see here that I've got my next stitch right in between those, the feet of those A's right there. Pop this guy out so that it's out of my way. And make sure I have the right yarn for this. Pick this guy up. It's always a little bit fiddly when you're picking up stitches, but you just use some patience and some good needlework and you'll be all right. So there we are on number 2 of the official pattern, and that's our extra stitch for closing up the hole later. All right, and you can see the stitches are coming out nice and even. They're following the logic of the columns as we go. Okay, so right now we have our extra stitch on the end, which we can tighten up with our tail over here if we want to. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 actual pattern stitches on our needle so far. And you can see, I think you can start to see here that we have a stitch, especially in the columns where we have a different color. We have a stitch for each column. So this stitch goes with this column, this stitch goes with this column, and on and so forth. And that way you're making sure that you're not, you know, moving things too far sideways as you pick up these stitches. And now we're at our center stitch. Now we know that the center stitch is on the next part of the repeat of this pattern. This particular pattern has 18 stitch repeats. We have 9 stitches here going into the sleeves. We have 9 stitches over here, and we'll have 9 here, and then 9 and before we get to the next repeat over here. So let me just double check myself. I've got my extra stitch, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yay, it worked. And we're at our center stitch. So you probably should put a beginning of round marker here. And what I'm going to do is actually pop this guy off because this is going to become my beginning of round marker. Put it there so that I know. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick up from my next column, which is right here. And this is the beginning of the next 9 stitches that we're going to need to pick up across the armpit. Now in this particular pattern, the designer calls for those first 9 stitches to be just knit in the main color. And then the second 9 stitches, once you put your beginning of round marker, to be knit in pattern because we're starting the first round of the sleeve. So I'm going to bring over my contrast color, get my sweater a little better oriented here for the pickups. And I've got my pattern off camera telling me what stitches I should be working for this first row. And you can see I'm still following the same logic. I have my column here that I've just picked up a stitch for. Now I'm looking for my next column, and I already removed the stitch marker, so I can see that it's right here. Like I said, harder in the gray to see, but that's exactly where it needs to be. So here's our next column. It's right here. And we're going to loop in the contrast color, just like you would any other time that you're adding in a new ball of yarn. So there's our first contrast color stitch. And now we're going to go back for 2 more main color stitches. So here we have all of our stitches picked up. There are 18 total, and there were a few things we wanted to keep in mind. We wanted to remember that our stitch orientation was upside down, so we wanted to make sure that our columns lined up with the stitches we were actually picking up so that everything wouldn't be shifted in any kind of funny way. We needed to make sure that we knew where the midpoint was, and we marked it with our beginning of round marker. And we needed 9 stitches on each side in order to be in pattern for the rest of the sleeve. We also picked up 2 extra stitches on either side that we're going to knit together with our sleeve stitch once we come around to them. This one we have to wait because we just picked it up, so on the next round we'll get it. And we're going to knit 2 together to keep things from creating any kind of holes in those sides of the sleeves. So let me knit a couple rounds and I'll show you what it looks like on the right hand side. So let's see where we're at the end of this tutorial. We have a lot of sleeve left to go, obviously, but we've accomplished a lot of the things that we wanted to look out for when we were picking up stitches for our sleeve. So for example, we have our center stitch here, and it lines up very nicely with that longer column of stitches that was marking the center of our underarm there. And we have picked up our 9 stitches on each side so that we know we'll be in pattern as we're going around the sleeve here. And we've also eliminated holes in our sleeve. So right here we don't have a hole, and once that sits down, you'll see that the pattern connects up very nicely across the entire body of the sweater. Huge hat tip to Nargis Rashid for asking for this particular tutorial. If you have a suggestion for a tutorial, please send me an email at knittingthestash@gmail.com or leave me a comment on any of these tutorial videos, and I'll do my best to get something in the queue if I can. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.